Some lights were built to warn you away from the rocks. But there is another kind of light, older, patient, indifferent to your safety, that exists only to show you what was always there, waiting beneath the surface for someone willing to look down. If these midnight confessions have found you before, then you already belong to the Masquerade. But if this is your first time standing at the threshold, step forward now. Join the hidden circle. Leave your signal on the dark glass so others may follow. Summon the bell, and you will never miss the next beam that cuts through the fog. And if something out on the water has already caught your eye, confess it below, before the light swings back around. Let me say this clearly before I begin, because I need you to understand the kind of person I was before all of this. I was not someone who believed in much of anything beyond what I could measure, photograph, and file in triplicate. I was not spiritual. I was not superstitious. I did not have ghost stories around campfires as a kid or a grandmother who read tea leaves. I grew up in Duluth, worked construction out of high school, transitioned into facilities maintenance in my late 20s, and by the time I was 34, I had a commercial contractor's license and a small operation, 2 employees, a 16-foot aluminum boat, and a roster of municipal and federal clients who needed someone to keep aging infrastructure from falling into Lake Superior. My name is Joel Brecker. For the past 5 years, I performed quarterly structural inspections on 7 lighthouse stations along the Minnesota and Wisconsin shoreline of Lake Superior. Most of them are fully automated now, have been since the 70s or 80s. The Coast Guard decommissioned the last staffed light station on the American side of the lake in 1983, but the structures remain. Some are National Historic Register properties. Some are managed by local preservation societies. A few are still active navigational aids with modern LED optics and solar battery systems bolted inside the old iron lantern rooms. They don't need keepers anymore. They need maintenance contractors. They need someone to check for ice damage every spring, repaint the fog signal housing every summer, inspect the mortar joints in the fall, and make sure the heating elements in the lantern rooms haven't failed before the January storms. That's what I did. That's all I did. The lighthouses were just buildings to me. Stone, brick, cast iron, concrete. They had foundations that cracked and roof lines that leaked and metal fixtures that corroded in the salt-heavy air that rolls off the lake. They were not romantic. They were not haunted. They were infrastructure, old, expensive, politically protected infrastructure that no one wanted to fund properly, but everyone wanted preserved for tourism brochures and historical society galas. I kept them standing. I filed condition reports. I invoiced the county or the historical trust, or, in 2 cases, the Coast Guard's legacy property office in Cleveland. It was good, steady, quiet work. The kind of work where the biggest emergency is a cracked gasket or a shipment of marine sealant arriving 2 days late. The kind of work where you eat your lunch sitting on a rock looking at the lake, and the worst thing that happens is the wind blows your sandwich wrapper into the water and you feel guilty about it for the rest of the afternoon. I need you to hold that version of me in your mind. The version who drove his truck along Highway 61 with a thermos of gas station coffee and a clipboard and thought about mortar composition and drainage grades and whether the vendor in 2 Harbors had the right gauge of stainless lag bolts in stock. The version who listened to public radio and called his mother on Sundays and fell asleep most nights to the sound of the lake through a window he kept cracked even in winter because the cold air helped him breathe. That was the man who first walked into Voss Point Light Station in April of 2019. And that is not the man talking to you now. Voss Point is not a lighthouse you've heard of. If you search for it, you may find a single mention in a 1987 inventory of Great Lakes navigational structures published by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's listed as Station 9-71-VPL, Lake Superior, Minnesota, North Shore. Decommissioned 1971, automated optic installed 1974, deactivated 1998, structure transferred to St. Freeling County Historical Preservation Trust, 2003. There's no photograph in the inventory. There's no visitor page. There's no gift shop or guided tour or volunteer docent program. Voss Point sits on a basalt shelf about 22 miles northeast of Silver Bay, accessible by a gravel service road that branches off a forest road that branches off a county road that most GPS systems don't acknowledge. The shelf drops 40 feet into the lake on 3 sides. On the 4th side, the boreal forest comes right up to the service road and stops, as if the trees collectively decided they'd gone far enough. The lighthouse itself is a 38-foot conical tower built in 1911, white-painted brick over a limestone block foundation, with an attached keeper's quarters, a small 2-story house, maybe 900 square feet, with a pitched roof and a single chimney. The lantern room at the top of the tower holds the original 4th-order Fresnel lens, which hasn't been lit since the automated optic was removed in 1998. There's a detached fog signal building about 60 feet northeast of the tower and a concrete oil house converted to a storage shed sometime in the 1960s. A wooden dock, long since collapsed, once extended from the rock shelf into the lake. Its pilings are still visible at low water, dark and jagged, like a row of rotten teeth. I took over the Voss Point contract in early 2019. The previous contractor, a man named Dean Olson, who'd been maintaining the property for 11 years, had retired to Arizona. I never met him in person. The handoff was managed through the Historical Trust's property coordinator, a woman named Margaret Haldane, who sent me a box of Dean's files along with the standard service contract. Dean's files were meticulous. He used a system of color-coded tabs and typed his reports on what I believe was an actual typewriter. The ribbon was fading by the last few years, the letters getting thin and ghostly on the page, but his observations were sharp. His last entry from October 2018 noted minor spalling on the south-facing brickwork, a failed gutter bracket on the keeper's quarters, and a recommendation to replace the cellar door gasket before spring melt. At the bottom of the report, in handwriting that didn't match his typed entries, looser, faster, written in a single urgent breath, was a single line. It read, "Second beam observed. Duration 7 minutes. No action taken. See station log 1946 to 1948. I assumed it was a note to himself. Something about the automated optic, maybe. Some electrical artifact he'd been tracking. I set the box of files on the shelf above my desk at home and didn't think about it again for 6 months. My first visit to Voss Point was April 14th, 2019. Late spring on Superior still feels like deep winter. There was ice in the sheltered crevices of the basalt shelf and old snow banked against the north wall of the keeper's quarters. The access road was passable but soft, the gravel giving way to mud in patches where the meltwater had nowhere to drain. And I had to park about 300 yards out and walk the rest with my gear. The air smelled the way it always smells on the North Shore in April: cold iron, pine resin, and the faint mineral tang of the lake itself. A smell that's not quite salt and not quite stone, but something in between that you never stop noticing. The trust had given me a key to the main entry, a heavy iron thing, almost theatrical in its age, and a 4-digit code for the padlock on the oil house where Dean had stored backup supplies. The property was in decent shape. Dean had done good work. The brickwork needed attention in a few spots, and the keeper's quarters had a persistent damp smell that suggested a drainage issue under the foundation. Not rot, not yet, but the kind of slow moisture intrusion that becomes rot if you ignore it for a few more years. I spent the first day doing a full exterior walk-around, photographing every elevation, checking the foundation joints, testing the gutter system by running a hose from the hand pump at the old cistern. I ate lunch on the basalt shelf, a ham sandwich from the gas station in Silver Bay, an apple, a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and watched an ore carrier move across the horizon so slowly it looked painted on the water. A bald eagle passed overhead while I was finishing the apple, close enough that I could hear the creak of its wing beats. And for a few minutes, Voss Point was just a beautiful, lonely place where a man could eat his lunch in peace. The tower itself was sound. The spiral stair inside was original cast iron, narrow and cold, with a central column that rang like a bell when you brushed it with your tool belt. Each step had a slightly different pitch, so climbing felt like ascending a dull, chromatic scale. The lantern room at the top was dry, clean, and bare, except for the Fresnel lens, which sat in its brass frame like a jewel in a dead crown. It caught the late afternoon light and threw faint prismatic shapes across the glass panes. Beautiful, in a cold way. I photographed it, noted no damage, and climbed back down. It was on that first visit, while inspecting the keeper's quarters for the interior condition report, that I found the logbook. The keeper's quarters had been partially cleared out over the decades. The Historical Trust had removed most of the original furnishings in 2004 for archival storage. What remained was institutional and sparse, a metal desk with a drawer that stuck, 2 wooden chairs with ladder backs worn smooth by decades of use, a bookshelf with a handful of navigation manuals, and a 1965 edition of the Coast Guard Light List. The kitchen still had its original cast iron sink stained the color of old tea, and a window above it that faced north toward the lake. It was the kind of room where silence had weight. In the cellar, which was accessible through a narrow door off the kitchen, a door so low I had to duck, the lintel worn concave by a century of hands steadying themselves on the way down, I found a section of shelving that had been overlooked. It was behind the furnace, an ancient cast iron gravity unit that hadn't functioned in years, its surfaces furred with a fine rust that came off on your fingers like red chalk. The shelving held a few rusted coffee cans full of bolts, a coil of copper wire gone green with oxidation, and a hardcover book bound in dark green cloth. The book was a station logbook, standard government issue, pre-printed with columns for date, weather, barometric pressure, wind direction and speed, visibility, vessel traffic, light status, and keeper's remarks. The cover was stamped in faded gold, U.S. Lighthouse Service Station, Log Voss Point Light Station, Minnesota. Below that, handwritten in careful black ink, Keeper H. Sjodahl, commenced March 1946, Henrik Sjodahl. I didn't know the name then. I know it now the way you know the name of someone who has rearranged the interior of your life without ever being in the same room as you. I know it the way you know a voice you've only read. I brought the logbook upstairs and paged through it in the gray light of the kitchen window. The first entries were what you'd expect: weather observations, barometric readings, lamp maintenance, fog signal tests. The language was plain, efficient, professional. Sjodahl wrote like a man who respected the form he was filling out. March 17, 1946, clear, bar 30.12, northwest 8 knots, visibility unlimited, no traffic, light operating normal, lens cleaned, fog signal tested, satisfactory, and so on. Day after day, the rhythm of a man alone in a lighthouse, keeping time with instruments and weather and the slow turning of a lens. The entries for the first several months were unremarkable. I skimmed them, turning pages carefully. The paper was brittle at the edges, foxed with age, and smelled faintly of damp stone and old iron. I was mostly interested in structural observations that might help me understand the building's maintenance history. Sjodahl occasionally noted repairs: a cracked pane in the lantern room replaced, a gasket on the fog signal compressor changed, the cistern pump rebuilt. He was thorough. He ordered supplies with precision, noted delivery dates, and once wrote a mildly irritated paragraph about a shipment of kerosene that arrived 3 weeks late from the district depot. Then, in September of 1946, the entries changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was the kind of shift you only recognize when you go back and read it a second time, knowing what comes later. On September 9, 1946, Sjodahl wrote, overcast, bar 29.87, E 12 knots, viz 4 miles diminishing, 1 vessel eastbound, identified as ore carrier, no signal, light operating normal. At approximately 02:15 observed a secondary illumination on the water surface bearing NNE, approximately 2 miles offshore. Duration approximately 3 minutes. Source not identified, not consistent with vessel traffic. Weather and visibility do not explain. Will monitor. The next several entries make no mention of it. He went back to weather and barometric pressure and the slow catalog of a solitary professional's days. Then on September 22nd, clear, bar 30.21, northwest 6 knots, visibility unlimited, no traffic, light operating normal, Secondary illumination observed again at 0148, bearing NE, estimated 1.5 miles. Duration 5 minutes, distinct from primary beam. The light does not originate from the station optic. It appears to emanate from a point at or just above the water surface. Color is consistent with the primary beam, but the angle of incidence is wrong. I have checked the lens assembly and the reflector for defects. There are none. The second light is not a reflection. I read that sitting at his desk in his kitchen with the last of the April daylight draining out of the window. I remember the moment clearly because I almost didn't keep reading. I almost closed the book and shelved it and wrote it off as the observations of a man who'd been alone too long in a lighthouse on a rock in the largest freshwater lake on Earth. Isolation does things to perception. Every manual on light station operations acknowledges this. It's why the Lighthouse service rotated keepers, why they encouraged families to live on station when possible, why the psychological fitness section of the keeper's examination was quietly expanded 3 times between 1910 and 1939. But I didn't close the book. I told myself it was professional curiosity, the kind of due diligence that makes a good contractor. A crack in the lantern room glass creating a secondary refraction. A flaw in the Fresnel lens. I was rationalizing. I know that now. The truth is that something in Sjodahl's prose, the precision of it, the calm, the absence of drama, made me trust him. He wrote like a man documenting a phenomenon he did not understand, with the same rigor he applied to barometric pressure. Over the following weeks of his log, the secondary illumination appeared with increasing regularity. By October 1946, he was observing it 2 to 3 times per week, always between 0100 and 0300, always bearing NNE, always at approximately the same distance offshore. He began timing it precisely. He sketched diagrams of its position relative to the primary beam, careful pencil drawings in the margins with angles marked and distances estimated. He noted that it did not sweep. The station's light rotated on a clockwork mechanism, producing a characteristic flash pattern 1 second on, 4 seconds off, visible for 14 nautical miles in clear conditions. But the second light was constant. It did not rotate, it did not flash. It simply appeared, held steady for a measured duration, and then ceased. On November 3, 1946, he wrote something that I have not been able to stop thinking about in the years since. Clear, bar 30.09. Wind 5 knots, visibility unlimited, no traffic, light operating normal, secondary illumination observed 0137 to 0151, duration 14 minutes, longest observation to date. For the first time, I directed the station binoculars at the illuminated area. The primary beam on its sweep passes over the same water. When the primary beam illuminates the area, I see open water. Normal wave action. Nothing remarkable. But when the secondary illumination is active and the primary beam has swept past, the water in that area does not look the same. I do not mean it is a different color. I mean it does not behave like water. The surface appears to be stable. Solid is not the right word. Still is not the right word. The closest I can describe it is that the water under the second beam looks as though it has been water for a very long time and has only just stopped. I closed the book after that entry. Not because I was frightened, because it was dark outside and I was alone at Voss Point, and I had an hour's walk back to my truck and a long drive to my motel in Silver Bay. I packed the logbook into my equipment bag and told myself I'd return it on my next visit. The drive back was quiet. Highway 61 at night is a strange road. The lake on your right is just absence, a vast dark nothing that you know is water, only because of the sound and the occasional flash of a navigation buoy. The motel in Silver Bay was a small place off the highway, 12 rooms, a parking lot that smelled of diesel from the taconite trucks that idled there overnight. I sat on the bed under a light that buzzed faintly and opened the logbook and read the November 3rd entry one more time, and then set it on the nightstand and lay there listening to the trucks and the wind and thinking about water that had only just stopped. I read the rest over the following weeks, at home in Duluth, at my kitchen table, with the window cracked and the lake audible 4 blocks away. My apartment was on the second floor of a converted house on a hill street that sloped toward the water, and on still evenings you could hear the lake from every room. Not waves, exactly, but a presence, a low, continuous sound like breath held just below the threshold of language. I'd come home from other job sites, routine inspections at lighthouses that were just lighthouses, hang my jacket on the hook by the door, make dinner, wash the dishes while the evening light faded over the rooftops toward the water. Then I'd sit down with the logbook and a yellow legal pad and enter Sjodahl's world. Some nights I'd only read a few entries before the weight of his solitude pressed me back into my own kitchen, my own life. And I'd close the book and watch something meaningless on television just to hear voices that weren't trapped in ink from 1946. Other nights I couldn't stop. I'd look up and the apartment would be dark except for the lamp over the table, and the coffee in my mug would be cold, and the lake outside the window would be making its sound, and I'd realize I'd been sitting there for 3 hours reading the words of a dead man, or a missing man, or a man who had become something other than missing, and the distance between his solitude and mine had collapsed to the width of a page. Sjodahl's entries through the winter of 1946 into 1947 are a slow, meticulous chronicle of a man studying something impossible with the tools of a disciplined observer. He measured, he timed, he cross-referenced weather conditions and moon phases and vessel traffic and found no correlation. The second beam appeared independent of all variables except one, which he noted in February 1947. It appeared more frequently and for longer durations during periods of absolute calm on the lake. When Superior was still truly still, which anyone who knows the lake will tell you is rare and somehow more unsettling than the worst storm, the second beam came almost nightly. In March 1947, Sjodahl did something that the professional in me understood and the rest of me wished he hadn't. He climbed the tower during an observation and stood in the lantern room with the Fresnel lens rotating beside him and watched the second beam from the highest vantage point available. His entry that night is the longest in the book. I can see it more clearly from the lantern room. The second light originates from a fixed point on the water. I estimate the position at 47 degrees 28 minutes north, 91 degrees 3 minutes west, though I cannot be certain without better instruments. The light is broad and even, like sunlight filtered through deep water, except that it comes from above the surface, or from the surface itself. I cannot distinguish which. When I look at the area it illuminates, I see what I described before. Water that has ceased being water. But from this height I can see farther into the illuminated area. And there is something else. I want to be precise. I do not see shapes. I do not see objects. I see organization. The surface within the illuminated area has structure. There are lines, or what my eyes interpret as lines. They are regular. They are intentional. This is not wave action. This is not ice formation. I have watched this lake for a year, and I know what its surface does under every condition. What I saw tonight is not any condition I have a name for. I watched for 22 minutes. When the light ceased, the water resumed. I stood in the dark for another hour, waiting. It did not return. The lake was just the lake again. But I no longer believe it always is. He made no report to his district supervisor. He noted this explicitly in an April 1947 entry. I have considered filing a report on the secondary illumination, but I do not know what category it would fall under. It is not a hazard to navigation. It is not a structural deficiency. It is not a weather phenomenon I can name. If I report it, I will be evaluated. And if I am evaluated, I will be transferred. And if I am transferred, no one will watch for it, and it will continue without being recorded. I believe it is more important that it be recorded. That line stayed with me. I believe it is more important that it be recorded. The logic of a man who had moved past fear and into something more like obligation. A keeper who had decided that keeping was not just about the light in the tower, but about the light on the water. I thought about it driving home that evening and again the next morning over coffee, standing at my kitchen sink watching the pale strip of lake visible between two apartment buildings 4 blocks downhill. I thought about it on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while regrouting a foundation joint at a different lighthouse 30 miles south. A lighthouse that was just a lighthouse, and I realized the logbook had already changed the way I looked at every structure I maintained. Not because I expected to find something wrong, because I had started to wonder what they were keeping. Through the summer and fall of 1947, his observations grew more detailed, but his language grew quieter. He stopped trying to explain what he saw. He simply described it. The durations grew longer, 30 minutes, 45, once an entire hour. The illuminated area sometimes expanded. On calm nights, he estimated it covered a quarter-mile of surface. He noted that the organized structure became more defined over time, as though whatever existed in that water was slowly clarifying, or rising, or remembering its own arrangement. In December 1947, he wrote the entry that I believe was the beginning of the end for him. Overcast, bar 29.71, calm, viz 2 miles in fog, light operating normal. Secondary illumination observed 0109. Duration ongoing at time of writing has not ceased in over 90 minutes. Tonight I did something I have not done before. I extinguished the primary light, I shut down the clockwork, closed the damper on the lamp, and stood in the lantern room in darkness while the second beam continued over the water. I wanted to see what it illuminated without the interference of the station light. I wanted to see it on its own terms. I am writing this entry by the light of a kerosene lamp in the kitchen because I do not want to be in the tower right now. What I saw was the water. Gone. Not drained, not frozen. Gone. Replaced by something that was using the shape of the lake, the way a man uses the shape of a suit. Underneath there was a regularity that I cannot call architecture because architecture implies human intention. This was organized the way a crystal is organized, or the way a living cell is organized by laws that do not require an architect. It went down farther than the lake is deep. The second beam showed me the depth of it, and the depth was wrong. Lake Superior is 1,332 feet at its deepest sounding. What I saw had no bottom that the light could find. I relit the station light. When the primary beam resumed its sweep, the lake was the lake again. I have not slept. He kept his post through the winter. The entries from January and February 1948 are shorter, more clipped, as though he was rationing language the way a man rations water when he isn't sure the well will hold. He still recorded weather and barometric pressure with perfect accuracy. He still maintained the light. He still tested the fog signal. But the remarks column shrank to single lines. Second beam observed. 47 minutes. Structure visible. No action taken. Or calm. Second beam 0200 to 0340. Depth visible. No bottom. Or simply, it was there again. The last full entry is dated March 11th, 1948. Clear, bar 30.15. Calm, vis unlimited. Light operating normal. I have made a decision. I have spent 2 years watching something I cannot explain, and I have come to understand one thing about it. The second beam is not a phenomenon. It is a disclosure. It is showing me what the lake is when no one looks at it with the right light. I do not think it is dangerous. I think it is accurate. But accuracy and safety are not the same thing. And I need to say this plainly for whoever reads this log. Do not look for the second beam. If it finds you, document it. Measure it, time it. But do not go to the lantern room when the primary light is off and the second beam is active. Do not look at the water under only that light. You will see the truth of it, and the truth is not shaped for human understanding. It is too organized. It is too deep. It is too patient. And I believe, though I cannot prove that when you look at it under the second beam, it clarifies further. I believe observation itself is part of its process. Each time I have watched, there has been more definition, more structure, more specificity. I think it is assembling itself, and I think our attention is one of the things it requires to do so. I am going to stop watching. I am going to request a transfer. If the Bureau denies my request, I will resign. I will leave this log in the station for my replacement. I am sorry I cannot be more helpful. I am sorry I cannot tell you what it is. I can only tell you that it is there, that it is patient, and that it is not finished. Henrik Sjodahl never filed a transfer request. According to the records I later obtained from the National Archives branch in Chicago, he was listed as absent without leave from Voss Point Light Station as of March 19, 1948. A relief keeper was dispatched from the Duluth District Office on March 23rd. The relief keeper's report, which I had to file a formal records request to see a process that took 4 months and 3 follow-up letters, Noted that the station was in good operational order. The light was functioning, the fog signal was operational, and the keeper's quarters were clean and orderly. Sjodahl's personal effects clothing, a few books, a shaving kit, a pair of reading glasses on the nightstand were still present. His log was not mentioned. There is no further record of Henrik Sjodahl in any database I have been able to search. No death certificate, no social security record after 1948, no forwarding address, no family contact in his personnel file beyond the sister Elsa in Marquette, Michigan, whose house was demolished in 1967 to make way for a grocery store parking lot. He came to Voss Point in March 1946, and he was gone by March 1948, and in between he watched something that watched him back, and he left a book on a shelf behind a furnace, and for 71 years, no one read it. Then I did. I want to be honest about what happened next, because honesty is the only thing I have left that I trust, and even that trust has conditions now. I completed my spring 2019 inspection at Voss Point. I filed my report with the Historical Trust. I noted the spalling, the drainage issue, the gutter bracket. I did not mention the logbook. What I actually did was keep it on my kitchen table in Duluth and read it again. And again. I went through Sjodahl's entries with a yellow legal pad and mapped his observations chronologically. I plotted the coordinates he estimated on a NOAA nautical chart I bought from the marine supply store on Lake Avenue, spreading it across the kitchen floor on my hands and knees and marking the position with a red pen. The spot, 47 degrees 28 minutes north, 91 degrees 3 minutes west, is open water. No shoal, no island, no wreck on the charts. Just depth contour lines and the pale blue of deep water, and the small red circle I'd drawn around a point where, according to every instrument available, there was absolutely nothing to see. That chart stayed on my floor for 2 weeks. I stepped around it every morning on my way to make coffee, and every morning I looked down at the red circle, and every morning it meant a little more. I checked historical weather records against his observation dates. He was right that the second beam correlated with calm conditions. Every date he logged an observation, the National Weather Service archives confirmed light winds and minimal wave action on the western lake. The man was precise. Frustratingly, undeniably precise. My summer inspection was scheduled for July 2019. I went during the day as I always did. The drive up Highway 61 was warm for the first time that year, windows down. The lake glittering to the right, the birch trees full and green along the road. I stopped at the same gas station in Silver Bay where I always stopped, bought the same coffee and the same sandwich, and exchanged the same few sentences with the woman behind the counter who had never once asked my name. These are the rhythms of contract work on the North Shore. You become part of the scenery's routine as much as it becomes part of yours. At Voss Point, I completed the exterior work, repointed the mortar on the south elevation, replaced the gutter bracket, treated the keeper's quarters door with marine sealant. The work was slow, physical, good. The kind of labor where your mind can wander because your hands know what to do. And my mind wandered north, northeast, out over the water, to a point I couldn't see from the basalt shelf because there was nothing there to see. Not during the day, not under this light. I ate lunch on the rock, watching a taconite carrier move east, its red hull bright against the water. I tried to see the surface the way Sjodahl had described it. I couldn't. It was just water. Cold, deep, supremely indifferent water that would kill you in 20 minutes if you fell in, even in July. I went home. I filed my report. I did not mention the logbook. The fall inspection was October 2019. I scheduled it as a 2-day visit because I wanted to complete the cellar waterproofing assessment, and it was easier to stay overnight in Silver Bay than to make the drive twice. That's what I told myself. What I actually planned, what I'd been planning since July, if I'm being honest, was to be at the Lighthouse after dark. I finished my daytime work by 4 in the afternoon. The October light on the North Shore has a specific quality: low, amber, already grieving for the warmth it's about to lose. I drove to Silver Bay, checked into the motel, same room as April, same buzzing light, and ate dinner at the diner on the highway. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, coffee in a ceramic mug with a chip on the rim. The waitress called me Hun. The taconite trucks passed outside with a sound like slow thunder. I sat in a booth by the window and watched the sky darken and tried to name the feeling in my chest. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't dread. It was something closer to obligation, Sjodahl's word. And that parallel should have given me more pause than it did. Back at the motel, I set an alarm for 10, though I knew I wouldn't sleep. I lay on the bed with my boots still on, listening to wind push against the window, and went over my plan as though what I intended were a standard site visit, and not something that had kept me up for 3 consecutive nights in Duluth, staring at a red circle on a nautical chart. At 10:30, I drove back. The forest road was dark in the way that only a North Shore forest road can be dark, the kind of darkness that feels biological, as if the trees are producing it. I parked at the usual spot and walked in with a headlamp and my equipment bag, which contained, along with my tools, a pair of marine binoculars I'd purchased in August. The night was clear, the wind was negligible. The lake was calm, not perfectly, but calm by superior standards. The lighthouse tower stood black against the stars like a finger held to the sky's lips. I unlocked the keeper's quarters and set up in the kitchen. I made coffee on a portable stove, the blue flame hissing in the silence, the water taking a long time to boil in the cold air. I sat at the metal desk and reviewed my notes by the light of a battery lantern. The kitchen smelled of stone and damp and old iron, and now, faintly, of coffee. I felt foolish and alert in equal measure. I told myself this was due diligence. I told myself this the way a man tells himself the third drink is still social. At midnight, I climbed the tower. The spiral stair was cold under my boots. Each step rang as I placed my weight on it, that ascending chromatic scale. Except now, in the dark, with only the headlamp cutting a white circle on the iron above me, the sound was different, more intimate, as if the tower were a throat and I were a sound it was making. The lantern room was exactly as I'd left it that afternoon, the Fresnel lens motionless in its brass frame, the glass panes clean, the circular walkway outside accessible through a narrow door I'd oiled in July. I stepped out onto the walkway. The lake stretched north and east into a darkness indistinguishable from the sky. There was no moon. The lighthouse's optic had been deactivated for over 20 years. There was no primary beam, there was no sweep. There was only the dark and the lake and the sound of water against basalt 40 feet below. I stood there for an hour. I watched. I saw nothing. My coffee went cold. My fingers stiffened. I felt cold and stupid and relieved, and the relief was so strong it almost felt like disappointment, which told me something about myself that I wasn't ready to examine. I went back down. I poured more coffee and cupped it in both hands, letting the heat work into my knuckles. I sat at Sjodahl's desk and read his September 1946 entry again. Secondary illumination observed. I almost laughed. I'd driven an hour in the dark to stare at water because a man who vanished in 1948 had written about a light that didn't exist in a book that no one had read. At 1:47 a.m., the kitchen window went white, not bright, white. The quality of the light was not like a searchlight or a flash or a reflection. It was ambient and total, as if the air itself had changed frequency. It lasted approximately 2 seconds and then faded to a steady, directionless glow that persisted outside the window like a winter dawn that had arrived 6 hours early. My hands stopped. The coffee mug threw a shadow it hadn't thrown 30 seconds before. I was at the tower stairs before I made any conscious decision to move. I climbed. The central column sang under my hand. The steps rang faster, louder, and I didn't care because the lantern room above me was full of light, not the warm yellow of my headlamp, but something cooler, steadier, older. The light passed through the lantern room as if the glass and iron and brick were all equally transparent to whatever produced it. I stepped onto the walkway and looked north-northeast. The second beam was there. It was exactly as Sjodahl described. A broad, even illumination on the surface of the water, roughly 1.5 miles offshore, covering an area I estimated at 1/4 mile across. It did not move. It did not pulse. It did not sweep. It was simply there, like a hole cut in the darkness, revealing a different kind of night underneath one that had its own light source, its own rules. I raised the binoculars. The water inside the illuminated area was not water. I need to be careful here. I need to say what I saw, not what I interpreted, because interpretation is where Sjodahl's entries became unbearable to me, and I don't want to do that to you. The surface was stable. It had the visual texture of water, the color, the slight variation in shade, but it was not moving, not frozen, not still in the way that water in a glass is still, where you know it would move if you touched it. This was still in a way that suggested it had never moved. That movement was not a property it possessed. It looked like a photograph of water, except a photograph doesn't have depth, and this did. Below the surface, and I could see below it, the light penetrated with a clarity that made the binoculars almost superfluous. There were structures. I am not going to call them buildings. I am not going to call them ruins. Every noun I reach for implies a human origin, and what I saw was not human in origin. They were regular, they were geometric, they were vast. They extended downward beyond what the light revealed, and what the light revealed was already deeper than Lake Superior should be in that location. The NOAA chart has the lakebed at approximately 800 feet there. What I saw went deeper, and it did not end. Their regularity did not diminish with depth. If anything, it increased each layer more precise than the last, as though the deeper you looked, the more certain the pattern became of itself. I watched for 11 minutes. I know this because I had started a timer on my phone when I reached the walkway. 11 minutes of looking at something that should not be there, something organized on a scale and with a precision that I have no framework for, something that existed under the water of a lake I had worked beside for my entire adult life. And then the structures moved. Not dramatically, not suddenly. They shifted, like a sleeping thing adjusting its weight, like a vast pattern reorganizing along its own axis by a fraction of a degree. Lines that had been vertical tilted slightly. Surfaces that had been flat developed a faint curvature. The change was small, but it was synchronized. Everything moved together, as if the entire structure was a single thing. As if the geometry I was looking at was one form, one incomprehensibly large unified structure that existed below the lake, and had existed there before the lake, and would exist thereafter. And the water above it was not concealment, but a courtesy. A thin, cold, blue-black courtesy that kept human beings from seeing what they were floating on top of every time they launched a boat, or cast a line, or admired the view. The light went out. All at once. The darkness returned so completely I couldn't see my hands on the binoculars for several seconds. The lake was the lake again. I could hear waves. The water was moving the ordinary, reassuring movement of water that knows how to be water and has no interest in being anything else. I went down the stairs. I packed my bag without turning on the lantern. I walked to my truck in the dark, headlamp off, navigating by memory and the faint tree line against the stars. I drove to Silver Bay with my hands steady on the wheel, speed exactly at the limit, radio off, mind calmly and thoroughly disassembling everything I had believed about the world I lived in. I sat in my motel room until dawn. The buzzing light was off. I sat in the dark and listened to the taconite trucks and the wind and the distant, ever-present, suddenly not-so-simple sound of the lake. I did not sleep. At some point I realized I was gripping the edge of the mattress with both hands, and I did not know how long I had been doing that. In the morning I drove home to Duluth. I made coffee in my own kitchen and stood at the sink and looked out the window at the rooftop sloping toward the lake, at the pale strip of water visible between two apartment buildings, and I thought, that is the same body of water. I didn't finish the thought. I set the mug on the counter without drinking from it and sat down at my desk and began what I told myself was research. I called my doctor first, described non-specific sleep issues and stress, sat through a general evaluation that returned no abnormalities. She recommended melatonin and fewer late-night work sessions. I thanked her and drove home and understood that no amount of melatonin was going to help with this. The Sjodahl research took longer and led farther than I expected. I started with the National Archives and ended up in places I hadn't known existed: regional record depositories, Coast Guard historical offices, a retired maritime librarian in Marquette who answered my email 3 weeks late with a note that began simply, "I wondered when someone would ask about that station. I spent a long morning in a microfilm room in the basement of a federal building in Chicago, scrolling through personnel records on a machine that smelled of warm plastic and old toner. Sjodahl's file was thin. Hired 1941. Assigned to 2 stations before Voss Point 1 in Michigan, 1 in Wisconsin. Satisfactory performance reviews, no disciplinary action, no medical flags. What I did find, in a supplemental folder misfiled under a different station number, an error so convenient I have never fully decided whether it was accidental, was a single internal memorandum from the Coast Guard's 9th District Office, dated April 1948. It read, Voss Point Light Station, Station 9-71-VPL. Keeper Sjodahl, Henrik J., AWOL, since approximately March 19, 1948. Investigation concluded. No evidence of foul play. Personal effects to be disposed per standard procedure. Station log not recovered. Recommend no further inquiry. This matter is to be considered closed and should not appear in any district summary or annual report. By direction, station log not recovered. The log on my kitchen table, the log someone in the district office wanted confirmed as gone. Not found, but not recovered, as though its absence was the desired outcome of a search rather than an oversight. I should have stopped there. I should have returned the logbook to the Historical Trust and let Voss Point become just another lighthouse on my roster. Instead, I went back. January 2020. A winter inspection that I had every legitimate reason to conduct ice damage assessment is critical, and absolutely no legitimate reason to conduct at 2 in the morning. But there I was, standing on the lantern room walkway in 12-degree air, with the lake frozen to a quarter-mile out from shore and open water beyond, black and calm under a sky that made the darkness feel sealed. The second beam appeared at 1:22 a.m. It lasted 31 minutes. The illuminated area was larger, I estimated 1/3 of a mile across. The structures were clearer. The geometry was sharper. Sjodahl's observation was correct. It was resolving, as if each observation added something to its precision, as if attention itself were a developing agent and the thing beneath the water a photograph slowly emerging in a darkroom tray. And we were the chemistry it needed. I went back in April. The access road was muddy, and I carried my equipment the last half-mile, arriving with aching shoulders and boots caked in red clay. I went back in July when the basalt shelf was warm under my boots and the lake was so calm at midnight I could hear individual waves lapping against the rock 40 feet below with a clarity that sounded almost like language. I went back in October, in rain that turned to sleet, and stood on the walkway with ice forming on my jacket because the lake beneath the weather was calm, and the beam did not care about the rain any more than it cared about my comfort. Every quarter, as my contract required. Once during the day for the inspection, once at night for the beam. The daylight visits became the pretense, the nighttime visits became the purpose. I recognized this inversion the way you recognize the moment a habit becomes a dependency, not with alarm, but with a quiet, tired honesty that changes nothing. I began keeping my own log. Waterproof field notebook, mechanical pencil, the same kind Sjodahl used for his margin sketches, though I didn't realize this until later. And when I did, the recognition felt less like coincidence than like following a path someone had worn into the ground. I recorded dates, times, durations, weather, visible extent, structural details. I was careful, thorough. I was doing exactly what Sjodahl did. I understood this. I did it anyway. Between January 2020 and October 2021, 8 observations, I documented the following. The illuminated area expanded from 1/3 of a mile to over half a mile in diameter. The structures gained definition with each visit. I began to see surfaces within surfaces, layers of organization nested inside larger layers, like the cross-section of a cell under a microscope. Except the cell was the size of a small city beneath the largest freshwater lake in the world. The depth continued to be wrong. I could not see the bottom. I don't think there is a bottom. I think bottom is a concept that applies to lakes, but not to this. The durations increased. My earliest observation lasted 11 minutes. By October 2021, the beam persisted for over an hour, Once, in July 2021, it lasted the entire time I was on the walkway, 2 hours and 40 minutes, and showed no sign of fading when I went inside. I went inside because my hands were shaking. Not from cold, it was July, but from the sustained effort of looking at something my visual cortex kept trying to resolve into familiar categories and failing. My eyes ached, but the ache was painful the way stretching a muscle is painful, as if my capacity for perception were being deliberately expanded. And the movement, that slow, synchronized reorganization of the whole structure along an axis I couldn't name. It happened during every observation now, sometimes more than once. The structure was not static. It was not dead infrastructure. It was working, changing, proceeding towards something with the patience of a process that measures progress in centuries. Assembling. In January 2022, I saw something new. The beam was active. The structures were visible. The geometry was sharp and deep and moving in its slow, purposeful way. And then, in the upper portion of the illuminated area near the surface, I saw a shape that was not geometric. It was organic. Small relative to everything else, maybe the size of a person, though I have no confidence in that estimate. It was moving independently of the structure, moving the way a living thing moves, not with synchronized precision, but with the irregular, self-directed motion of something that has its own intentions. It was rising. I put the binoculars down. I didn't decide to. My hands lowered them before my mind formed the thought. I stood on the walkway in the dark and the cold and listened to my own breathing, ragged now. And I understood suddenly and completely what Sjodahl had understood in December 1947. The second beam is not a warning. It is not a malfunction. It is a disclosure. It shows you what is actually there. And what is actually there is becoming more present, more resolved, more organized, with every observation. And it is not just structure. There is something alive inside it, or something becoming alive, or something that was always alive and is only now becoming visible, the way a figure becomes clear when you adjust binoculars. Not arriving, not emerging, just becoming clear. And observation helps. That is the part I cannot escape. That is the part that keeps me up at night in my apartment in Duluth, 200 yards from the lakeshore, with the window I no longer keep cracked because I no longer want to hear the water listening to it anyway, because the walls are not thick enough and the lake is not quiet enough. Sjodahl said it. I believe observation itself is part of its process. He was right. Every time someone stands on that walkway and looks through the second beam, it clarifies. It advances. It becomes more. Not because looking creates it. I don't believe that. I believe it was always there, but looking at it, seeing it, recording it, that does something, feeds something, completes something. As if the final ingredient it needed was a witness. As if it had built a lighthouse before we ever did, and its light was always there, and the only thing it lacked was someone to stand in the lantern room and look where it was pointing. And I gave it 20 observations, 20 nights on the walkway, 20 measured, documented sessions of looking at something that grows clearer every time it's seen. I completed my last visit to Voss Point in October 2023. I did the daytime inspection. I filed the report, the last one, the neatest one, every measurement precise, as though I were writing my own professional epitaph. I did not go at night. It was the first quarter in 3 years that I hadn't climbed the tower after dark, and the restraint felt like pulling my hand out of a machine that had already taken the skin off 2 fingers. I did not renew my contract. Margaret Haldane sent a politely confused email. I told her I was reducing my client list for personal reasons. She found a new contractor, a man from 2 harbors, she said. Experienced, good references. She mentioned his name, and I deleted the email before I could read it twice. I don't know his name. I don't want to. Because I know what will happen. He'll do the spring inspection. He'll find the cellar and the shelf behind the furnace and the logbook. Or maybe he won't. Maybe it doesn't matter. I put it back on my final visit in exactly the spot where I found it, between the rusted coffee cans and the green copper wire. It belongs to the station, and the station belongs to the lake. But the logbook isn't the point. The point is that one night, curiosity, insomnia, the particular quality of silence that settles on a basalt shelf when the trees have stopped moving and the lake has gone still. He's going to look out at the water, and if the lake is calm and if the hour is right, he's going to see the second beam. And he's going to watch. Because that's what we do. That's what keepers do. That's what the light is for. Not the one in the tower. The other one. The one that has always been there, waiting for eyes. There's one more thing. I left it for last because I don't know what to do with it, and I thought maybe if I told the rest of the story first, the context would make it bearable. I don't think it does. But here it is. In April 2023, during my final spring inspection, I opened the logbook to the last page Sjodahl had written on March 11th, 1948. I'd read it dozens of times. I knew it by heart. But this time, something about the quality of the light in the kitchen that afternoon, the way it lay flat and gray across the page, as though even the daylight here had learned to be careful, made me turn the page. I'd turned past it before, early on, and found the remaining pages blank. Station logs have many more pages than any single keeper fills. They were designed to last decades. They were not blank anymore. The next page had an entry in black ink in handwriting I knew because I'd been reading it for 4 years, at kitchen tables and in motel rooms and in the lantern room by headlamp and in my dreams. It was Sjodahl's hand, careful, precise, the same controlled strokes, the same even spacing, the same slight leftward lean on the descenders. The entry was dated June 3rd, 2025. It read, clear, bar 30.18. Calm, viz unlimited, beam active, structure fully resolved, surface integration complete. The water is not water anymore. It has not been for some time. The keeper understands now. The keeper has always understood. The keeper is not the one who watches. The keeper is the one who is kept. Below that, in the same hand, was a second entry, dated November 9th, 2027. New keeper arrived. He will see the beam. He will document it. The process requires witnesses, and the lake provides them. This is not a warning. It is a record. The record is the mechanism. Keep the light. Keep the log. Be kept. I closed the book. I put it on the shelf. I walked out and locked the door with the iron key and stood on the basalt shelf for a long time, looking at the lake. It was afternoon. The water was choppy, ordinary, slate gray under a clouded sky. A gull turned above the collapsed dock pilings. The wind smelled of pine and cold stone. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as it appeared. And I no longer had any confidence that those two things were the same. I drove home. That was 2 years ago. I still live in Duluth. I can see the lake from my bedroom window. I've thought about moving somewhere inland, somewhere flat and dry where the largest body of water is a municipal reservoir, but I haven't, and I'm no longer sure whether that's stubbornness or something else. Some nights, when the air is still and the water is calm, there's a glow on the northern horizon that could be anything. A vessel, a distant town. The aurora beginning to stir. It could be anything. It could be. And I lie there, and I watch it. And I understand that even this, even lying in bed, even this far from Voss Point, even with the contract terminated and the key returned and the logbook back on its shelf, even this is observation. Even this might count. Sjodahl tried to stop watching. He disappeared. I stopped going. But I haven't stopped watching. I don't know if it's possible to stop once you've seen what the second beam reveals. I think the knowledge itself is a form of observation. I think remembering is a kind of looking. I think telling you this right now is a kind of light, a beam I'm casting into the dark, and wherever it lands, whatever it illuminates, it adds to the process. It clarifies the image by one more fraction. It brings the thing beneath the water 1 degree closer to whatever it is becoming. And I think if you've listened this far, you understand what that makes you. I'm sorry. I don't have a warning that would help. Sjodahl's warning didn't help me. The only honest thing I can tell you is what the logbook now says, in handwriting that belongs to a man who vanished 77 years ago, in entries dated years from now, in a record that appears to be writing itself forward through time with the calm precision of someone who has stopped distinguishing between past and future because the thing beneath the water does not recognize the difference. The keeper is not the one who watches. The keeper is the one who is kept. And the light, the second light, the one that was there before the tower, before the lake, before the name we gave the water. That light is not searching for anything. It already found us. It is simply waiting for enough of us to look.